Testing.
There we go. I'm really sorry about that, guys. Uh, Welcome to another Sunday Superversive live stream. I'm your host, Ben Wheeler, and I'm here with Anthony Marquetta, who is echoing. If you guys would forgive me, my microphone decided to glitch off and stop registering on my live streaming software for some awful reason. Anyway, as I was saying, the Reformation is the most important event in world history. It is more important than the fall of the Roman Empire. It is more important than the Crusades, even though the Crusades and the fall of the Roman Empire are very important events. Please understand that this is not so much about the world itself, because the death, burial, and resurrection of of Jesus Christ, is the sort of hinge-pin of all of Christianity. I am referring to sort of world history, if you get me. Uh, with that said, Anthony will have 60 minutes to discuss the pre-Reformation uh, up until the 95 Theses, give or take a decade or so. And then after he is finished, I will do the same, and then we'll talk about it briefly. I want to thank you all for joining today. Anthony, would you move forward with us?
I was muted for a second. Yeah, perfect. So, first thing to keep in mind, ground rules for what we're talking about and all of that. Number one, this is not a debate. Same rules as last time. This is I speak, Ben speaks. I did not see Ben's argument in advance. I actually showed Ben what I wrote in advance, and he did not even look at it, which is perfectly fine because it's not a debate. This is a Catholic perspective on the Reformation and a Protestant perspective on the Reformation, and for this stream, the events that led up to it. So, by a Catholic perspective, there are other important things to keep in mind. This is not an apologia or an apology for Catholicism. It's also not an apology for Protestantism. I am not making an argument in favor of the Catholic Church. The closest thing that you're going to get to that on one of these streams is what we did last stream, I think, unless Ben wants to do something more specific on that very topic, which I don't think we should do. But this is not an art. So again, to be clear, I am not making an argument in favor of Catholicism. I am not making an argument against Protestantism. There are claims against the Catholic Church that I am not going to address that a Protestant would probably have, and I assume vice versa. Instead, I am going to talk about what the Reformation means and what the lead up of the Reformation means to a Catholic, how a Catholic interprets it, uh, and generally how I understand it in the realm of world history. So, I'm going to mention now that I am not an expert. However, I did try and educate myself beforehand. What makes me say that I'm really still not even close to an expert, besides the fact there are experts on this topic, is that I have not read enough of the primary sources. I read some. I read a few of Luther's letters specifically. Uh, where I got my sources were A Mighty Fortress by Stephen Osmond, which is Protestant sympathetic, but a pretty good read. Professor Brandon, I think Watson, I think that's his last name. I'm not 100% sure because he rarely mentions it on his website. He has a blog called brandemeris.blogspot.com. If you check my notes that are linked in the description, you will find a link to it, or at least the name of the website. He has a history. He has been putting up a history of the Renaissance popes, and he did make it past the Reformation, which is a very entertaining read and highly recommended. The book "The Church and the Age of Reformations" by Joseph and Barbara Stewart. This is a Catholic perspective on the Reformation and its lead up, and the Catholic Encyclopedia for some fact checking. I also just did quick Google searches of things, so there's some like Infogalactic in there as well that I'm just assuming is accurate because it's not essential to any of the arguments that I'm making. If the facts that I get turn out to be wrong, by all means fact check me. If I were to like write a book on the Reformation, I would be looking almost exclusively at the primary sources. So this is very much like a broad stroke, getting the perspectives of a few academics and a few people who I think are interesting and I trust, and various sources just generally pulled together while I give, like, okay, I'm a Catholic. These are the facts as I understand them of the lead up to the Reformation. And this is how I interpret it and what it means for the world at large. So, for the Reformation, where it stems from, how you get there, you need to go back pretty far. Uh, I would say the first thing that I decided to mention is the investiture controversy. But specifically, in fact, I'm really going back a little bit further than that to the reign of Emperor Charlemagne, who was known as Blessed Charlemagne or Blessed Charles the Great in the Catholic Church. Not a lot of people know this, but he is actually a Catholic blessed, meaning that he is venerated in certain areas of Germany specifically. He's on their calendar of saints and things like that. So, Blessed Charlemagne, Blessed Charles the Great. Now, the medieval church and the Holy Roman Empire in the very early days had a very good relationship with each other, dating from the time of Blessed Charlemagne. So, Charlemagne had essentially single handedly liberated Italy and Northern Europe from the church's pagan enemies and ushered in a Christian golden age in the West, composing music, starting universities, making things safe for Christians, driving out the Vikings. Charlemagne is one of my favorite historical figures. I find him to be fascinating and in many ways a model king. He was not necessarily a model morally because he had multiple wives and things of that nature. But in terms of his kingship and his love for Christianity and the church specifically, I think that in many ways we should be looking to him as our model. So there were certainly power struggles between Charlemagne and the Pope. Specifically, there was a power struggle over, in fact, the Filioque controversy. I might be pronouncing that wrong since I've never learned how to pronounce it properly, but I am referring to what led to the Great Schism of, or one of the theological issues, I should say, that led to the Great Schism of 1054 between the Orthodox and Catholic churches. So, what is the Filioque controversy? And by the way, the fact that I'm getting into the Filioque controversy in a discussion about the Reformation should tell you why we're splitting this into multiple streams. But it is actually important to understand when I'm talking about, well, what sorts of issues did Charlemagne have with the church? One of the issues was that in the West, there was a change to the Nicene Creed, a clarification, really. Mongoose Man says Filioque. Thank you. I appreciate it. So, what you might call and what the Orthodox would call an addition, what the West would call a clarification. I am not here to talk about that controversy. That's not the discussion. But Charlemagne had a very specific opinion on it. Charlemagne and his team of theologians who worked for him believed that Filioque or the Filioque should be added to the Nicene Creed. Now, this is the part of the creed where we go that the Holy Spirit proceeds from the Father and the Son. That is what Filioque means. And the Son, right? Originally, the Nicene Creed was written with he proceeds from the Father, and the Son was not written there. That is still how the Nicene Creed is spoken in the Eastern churches, meaning the Orthodox churches, as well as any Eastern Catholic churches that are in communion with Rome. So it is not necessary that the Nicene Creed contains the Filioque. However, at the time, there was a huge debate going on between the East and West. The Eastern Fathers thought it violated their Christology. I'm not going to get into that because that's not what the discussion is about today. But the Pope, believe it or not, and a lot of people don't realize this, actually thought that the Eastern Church was in the right on this, and the Pope made a statement saying that he was not going to change the Nicene Creed. Charlemagne, in response to the Pope's statement, had his own team of theologians write up a response as to why the Filioque should be added. But there are a few things to note here. I think that Charlemagne saw himself as spiritually underneath the Pope, and this is emphasized by the fact that though he very much could and did have the power to take over the Vatican himself, he did not do that. Instead, he allowed the Pope to crown him. Now, he saw it as mutually beneficial to himself, but he still did it. And when the Pope opposed him in theological controversies such as the Filioque controversy, he did not respond to the Pope opposing him with force of arms. Instead, he wrote a theological response. And Charlemagne's theologians, of course, ended up winning the day in the long run in the Western Church. Now, I admit that this is an admittedly positive portrayal of Blessed Charlemagne, but he is a blessed for a reason. I think that Charlemagne I think he saw his role as spiritually underneath the Pope. I think that he saw himself as the Holy Roman Emperor because the Pope crowned him. That was very important to why he saw himself as a Holy Roman Emperor. And I think that he recognized that the Vatican had authority that he did not have as the king of an empire. So after Charlemagne, the relationship between the Holy Roman Emperors and the Holy Roman Empire and the popes becomes much more precarious. Now, we're going to fast forward here by quite a bit into the future, sadly, to the investiture controversy. We're skipping way, way ahead to the year roughly 1076. It is a controversy between Pope Gregory VII and Henry IV. So, this again is pretty complicated. In fact, I would say that what I'm about to give you is such a truncated version that I would really look this up yourself if you're interested. Essentially, the papacy claimed the authority to confirm emperors and noblemen, as well as to confirm new members of holy orders. And the Holy Roman Empire disputed it. They disputed, though, to be clear, all of these things. They did not only dispute the papacy's, meaning the Vatican's, authority to confirm emperors and noblemen, they also disputed their authority to confirm new members of holy orders. In other words, in this case, the relevant thing is bishops. So you might look at both sides and say that there is an overreach going on both ends here. And it's true this is often looked at as an abuse of church power in retrospect. But I am going to note here that it does go back historically to Charlemagne permitting himself to be crowned by the Pope. So it's not as if the papacy was conjuring up this claim to authority out of thin air. And even the most negative interpretation, that this is properly speaking an abuse of papal authority, I would argue not only can, but should admit that the Holy Roman Empire should not have a role in installing bishops. This is how you lead to corruption, bishops who are only bishops because they support the Holy Roman Emperor and who have no loyalty to the church. These bishops who were installed often ended by becoming noblemen slash administrators in the Holy Roman Empire. So, it is worth noting that the important points that were actually codified officially in councils claim church authority to confirm its own bishops, which often practically meant confirming nobility, because bishops often ended up becoming nobility. However, bishops are a spiritual office, and I'm making the argument that they should thus be under the thumb of the church as bishops. The fact that they also ended up becoming noblemen is a separate question, though related. Simony was very much in the news, so to speak, due to the relatively recent Pope Benedict IX selling the papacy not that long in the past. This is real, by the way. This is a man who has a strong, though by no means unchallenged, claim to the worst pope ever title. Pope Benedict IX, he sold the papacy, regretted selling it, came back with an army, to, if I'm remembering this right. I did not write up all of the details on here. So, this is a very, very long story short, but the short version of it is that the popes ultimately won out in the investiture controversy. They ended up keeping their ability to they ended up keeping the ability to install bishops against the wishes of the Holy Roman emperors, and those bishops ended up becoming nobility in the Holy Roman Empire anyway. So essentially, the Pope was installing his own members of the papal royal household, in a sense, in the Holy Roman Empire. The popes win this controversy. Like I said, this is a very long story short, and it's not quite as simple as just saying, well, one side won and one side lost, because honestly, they never really stopped fighting it. And in fact, it goes into the Reformation. So really, if you want to say who won, you could argue that the Holy Roman Empire won after the Reformation. So far as they even were the Holy Roman Empire at that point, it was really like a collection of kingdoms. So, after they quote unquote win the investiture controversy, physical papal power increases. I am referring by physical papal power to they get more territory, they gain more influence in politics. Culminating in Boniface, there is a typo in my notes, which somebody will probably notice uh, if they look at it. Boniface the Eighth's papal bull, Unum Sanctum. Unum Sanctum is one of the more controversial papal bulls. And in the bull, Boniface VIII basically says that the church can and should be a physical and temporal power as well as a spiritual one. And it is notable for having what is generally accepted to be, and I agree with, an infallible declaration made at the end of it. Namely, and I'm summarizing it, that for one to be in full union with the Catholic Church and thus saved, since extra ecclesiam nulla salus had been declared at a previous council, one must be in union with the Pope. The rest of the letter is not infallible, but that does not mean it is owed no deference at all. More on that later. So, this is a summary of events up to the point of Unum Sanctum. By the way, it is worth noting that Unum Sanctum was even controversial at the time it was written. The general populace, the church masses, were not very happy with it. And Boniface VIII was actually like driven out of Rome by an army, and then had to like retake Rome and executed everybody who rose up against him. But the church comes out of it in a stronger position than they were beforehand. So, this my interpretation of all of this. I think the church got too temporally powerful at certain points in its history. However, the importance of maintaining political autonomy is not lost on me in light of the current state of the Orthodox Church. In a rare moment, and I'm reading from my notes directly, of Francis being correct, actually, he calls out the Orthodox Church on being the puppets of Russia. This has been well known for a very long time, that they were essentially the puppet church of the Russian government, even when it was the Soviet Union. This is a legitimate and serious point. Alternatively, you look at places like the Coptic Church in Egypt, who has absolutely no political power and are constantly being persecuted. Later, we will see what happens when the churches get put under the thumb of the secular princes. This is going to happen later in the Reformation, and I actually won't be discussing it today, but next Reformation stream. Or you can even look at the pitiful state of the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops, in America today. They are a shameful lot, generally speaking. This is not true of every bishop, of course, but the Conference of Catholic Bishops are so afraid of what the American people and the American government will say and do that you really cannot rely on them for anything. So, we're going to skip ahead again. Once again, a fair distance. The Western Schism. So now we're getting closer to things that really have a direct bearing on the Reformation, because Martin Luther references the Western Schism several times in his debates during the Reformation. This happens in 1378. Once again, you are getting a badly, badly truncated version of it, so I encourage you to look this up yourselves. Bishops residing in Avignon, France, and Rome both claim to be the Pope, and then a third claimant from Pisa arises. Pisa being a city in Italy, the Leaning Tower of Pisa is from there. This leads to much confusion, and this is one of the great stains of the church. The Western Schism was a shameful thing. Truly a disaster, truly despicable. Now, after many years of confusion, St. Catherine of Siena is one of the principal leaders in sorry, I got distracted for a second. Anyway, St. Catherine of Siena is one of the principal leaders in resolving the Western Schism. And again, I'm skipping through how it was resolved and what happened. But the Council of Constance resolves the issue when two of the three claimants to the Pope step down, and Pope Martin V is elected. The third claimant holds out for a while longer, but eventually recognizes the new Pope, which doesn't stop some people from electing a successor to him, who is another anti-pope that at this point everyone pretty much ignored, and he fades into obscurity. Nobody takes it seriously. Again, at this point, all three of the original anti-popes have stepped down. A new guy steps up. Now, this confusion led to a massive desire for reform. So the reform movement that culminates in the Reformation and then eventually the Council of Trent actually starts after the Western Schism. Short version again. A series of popes desperately attempt major reforms but keep getting interrupted by war or disease. There are several councils that are held where they try to do reforms. The most notable is when they try and repair, and in fact temporarily repair, the East-West split in the Council of Florence. So the papacy at this point is at least not in schism anymore, but becomes extremely nepotistic, with family members being elected cardinals. You also have a lot of cardinals keeping mistresses and having affairs, and people knowing about this. Now, I will mention something briefly on the nepotism. I'm not going to defend, obviously, it would be sinful to defend cardinals having affairs and having families when they have taken vows of celibacy. However, when in terms of putting in family members as cardinals, well, this was taken to extremes, particularly under Pope Alexander VI. It must be understood with the context that if this didn't happen at all under any of the popes, then nothing would get done because the Pope would get no support. It was necessary, if they were going to enact any reforms at all, that he had to elect allies to the cardinals, to the College of Cardinals. Now, Alexander VI and Julius II are notable here as great secular monarchs who are each remembered for different reasons as terrible and corrupt popes. Alexander VI was that pope that I briefly mentioned who was extremely nepotistic. He was actually quite a brilliant negotiator. He took the Vatican, which was on the brink of being overrun by outside forces, and somehow managed to maneuver it into a pretty good situation at the end of his papacy. However, he was known for giving favors to his family and things like that, so he's not remembered as a good pope because he was immoral. Julius II was two popes after him. There was a pope in the middle who was not pope for very long. They elected him because he was old and assumed he wouldn't live very long, and they were right. So, Alexander VI and Julius II are notable here as a great secular monarch. They're each remembered. Oh, I'm sorry. That's my water bottle. Thank you for telling me. Are notable here anyway as secular monarchs who are each remembered for different reasons as terrible and corrupt popes. So Julius II was notable because he actually led an army out from the Vatican, like he fought in the army and he was taking land. And again, he actually puts the Vatican in a fairly good position politically, and were he a secular prince, he would probably be remembered fairly positively, but because he was a pope, is remembered negatively. Both fascinating people. I both recommend you look into both of them yourselves. Highly recommended. So after the Western Schism, the theory of conciliarism becomes popular. This becomes very important in the Reformation later. This is basically the idea that councils are above popes. It eventually fails. I'm closing the bottle and putting it away. That was that last bit. Sorry. Uh, but that was why you heard it again. Anyway, so after the Western Schism, the theory of conciliarism becomes popular, which is basically the idea that councils are above popes. This is more or less what the Orthodox believe, although I don't mean to strawman them, so if any Orthodox want to dispute that, feel free. I'm not Orthodox, so I'm not going to, and I did not research it for this stream. But it eventually fails because it becomes apparent quickly that in the climate of late medieval and early Renaissance Europe, frequently convening massive councils is way too costly and time consuming to adequately address all of the issues in the church. But it is regarded as a very legitimate theory for a long time in the West. So now at this point, we're getting to Luther. Now, I've skipped over so many things and have not gone into detail on so many things. So I'm going to look at some context of the times. By the way, even though I'm mentioning Luther now, I am on page 2 of 5 of my notes. But anyway, Luther's main concern in his original 95 Theses are the sale of indulgences. Now, for people who don't know, I will give a brief background, though I'm going to assume most people know. The 95 Theses were the original disputes that Luther posted on the door of the church in Wittenberg, or didn't actually post them there, but might as well have, that he posted in Wittenberg. and that he sent out to his Augustinian superiors in the hopes of starting at least discussions. It's unclear how much impact he thought they would have. Probably some. Did he mean to start a Reformation? I doubt it, at least not at first, though eventually it is pretty clear that he did. Now, Luther's main concern in his original 95 Theses, the 95 points of disputation that he had, are the sale of indulgences. So, what are indulgences? Properly speaking, an indulgence, a practice that very much does exist today, is when the church attaches remittance of your temporal punishment due to sin to some particular good work. Now, this is related to the church's authority to bind and loose. Indulgences, as a concept, still exist. For example, there is an indulgence associated with going to confession on Divine Mercy Sunday, and during the COVID pandemic, the Pope attached indulgence to saying a rosary for a cure for COVID. If you put up the rosary prayer cure for COVID, the Pope attached an indulgence to it. At the time, the Pope, when I say at the time, I mean at the time of the Reformation, or just beforehand, more realistically, the Pope was attaching an indulgence, meaning he was promising someone time or suffering remitted from purgatory, to the good work of giving alms to the church. That was the good work that the indulgence was attached to. Those alms were then used to build St. Peter's Basilica. This was not hidden, it was not a scandal. It was well known. Like, they told people, yeah, what are these alms going for? They're going to build St. Peter's. The stream is not meant to be an argument for or against indulgences theologically. However, I will make a note to say that if one accepts the authority of the church, I do think the concept of an indulgence logically follows, and if one accepts purgatory. But if you don't, then, there's that is literally an entirely different discussion, and you could probably have an entire debate on that. In fact, I know you can, because Luther had several. An indulgence absolutely cannot be used to reduce someone else's purgatorial suffering. This was condemned by Cardinal Cajetan, who was one of the leading theologians of the day, before Luther's excommunication. So, there was absolutely a lot of corruption around what is colloquially, not properly speaking, known as the sale of indulgences. Properly speaking, the indulgences were not being sold. You were doing a good work, and that good work was the giving of alms, and you were getting an indulgence as a reward for that good work. And even reward, I might not be speaking entirely accurately in terms of the terminology. It is well known, and it is correct, that Archbishop Albrecht purchased his archbishopric by siphoning off money from indulgence sales. It is also known that Johann Tetzel, appointed by Albrecht to collect indulgences in Germany, believed that one could use an indulgence to get a loved one out of purgatory. Again, Cardinal Cajetan rejects Tetzel's teaching here. Now, I'm going to defend Tetzel here for a moment. As far as we know about the actual facts of Johann Tetzel's life, he was not an immoral man. He was a Dominican friar. I have only ever seen him called a friar, so I actually am not sure if he is a priest or not. I've never seen him called a priest. I've also never seen anyone say he's not a priest, and friars can be priests. He was a Dominican friar. As far as we know, he lived a moral life. He was collecting indulgences, and he seemed to believe that his theology was correct. When Cardinal Cajetan condemns his theology, he stops teaching it. And he was going off of the opinions of some minor theologians. Indulgences were kind of a mysterious thing. They were very controversial in the church, even at the time. So, I am skipping some of Luther's backstory here for time purposes, too. It's important to note that at least some of Luther's attitude comes from him making a visit to Rome on behalf of the Augustinian monks, I believe it was several years prior, and being scandalized by the corruption he saw there, which is a plausible response from what we know of the corruption in the church at the time. So, Luther's 95 Theses are sent out to his superiors, and he seems to want to make a stir. Again, how much of a stir is unclear. Maybe he just wants to clean up the indulgence controversy. Johann Tetzel, who again was not corrupt, he was theologically mistaken about indulgences in an unfortunate way, is the first person to respond publicly to Luther's Theses, which had made a big impact in Germany at the time. Tetzel actually deserves some credit for being the first one to note that some of the stuff implied in the theses seemed to go further than a mere critique of indulgences, which again could really be stomached because a lot of people were very unclear on what indulgences were and the theology behind them and what authority the church had to give them. So, this is part one of the discussion, and for the last 2.5 pages, I am going to end on a cliffhanger by going on a tangent. What is the central claim of the Catholic Church that it rests its authority on? This is critically important to understanding the Catholic perspective of the Reformation. We're going to end on the cliffhanger of Tetzel giving out his response to Luther's 95 Theses. So, I would understand the Catholic claim about the its authority to be this. The Catholic Church was founded by Jesus Christ as an institution led by the apostles and their successors. Those apostles headed by Peter particularly and his successors. Christ promised the Catholic Church that the gates of hell would not prevail against it, which broadly is taken to mean that when the Catholic Church or its head, the successor of Peter, rules in its official capacity on a matter regarding faith and morals, it will not be in error. It also means that members of the church owe it and its teachings deference, even if those teachings don't rise to the level of infallibility, with the level of deference depending on how consistently that teaching has been taught and held to throughout the centuries of her existence, and what level of authority promulgates it. Now, if that sounds confusing to you, I actually don't think it should. It's sounding confusing because I am defining it into oblivion. Think of it as I truly do not think that the American government is infallible in anything that it does. I don't think that the American government the Constitution is infallible. I don't think the Supreme Court is infallible. I don't think that anything that they said is infallible. However, I do think that I owe the American government deference on many things, and the level of deference I owe them and on specific topics gets more and more complicated to describe on the various levels of what sort of deference I owe, who I owe deference to, who I should listen to. But broadly speaking, if I say that the American government is not infallible, but it has authority over me, people understand what I'm talking about. That is more or less the state of Catholics in regard to the church most of the time. Only when it's ruling in its official capacity on a matter regarding faith and morals does the charism of infallibility get invoked. So, we base this on promises of Christ and the testimony of the early Christians, which are known to us today as the Church Fathers. So, I'm going to note things that Christ did not promise. Again, this is from the Catholic perspective. I am not making an argument for it. If you want to see an argument for it, there is a book called Pope Peter that I recommend as a pretty good book on this topic. For Protestant responses, Gavin Ortland is generally the guy I point to as giving Protestant responses to interpretations of the Church Fathers. But anyway, Christ did not promise that the successor of Peter would always and every time make the correct decision. He also did not promise that there would be no corruption in the chair of Peter or in the church. In fact, Christ heavily implies the opposite when not long after calling Peter the rock, he refers to him as a stumbling stone. This is in the famous and vivid passage when Christ yells at Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." He also does not promise that the successors of the apostles would never mislead their flock. Now, we can put this in another way. How corrupt do the members of the church need to get to disprove Catholicism is making a category error. Is like asking how poor does the writing need to get before we reject a book as scripture. The answer to that question is the authority of scripture does not rest on the quality of the writing. Now, this is not an entirely academic issue, by the way. Martin Luther famously or infamously, depending on your perspective, calls the Epistle of James an epistle of straw, though he admits that there are some good things in it. And St. Augustine actually had serious issues with converting to the church because he did not think that the writing and rhetoric of the Bible was up to the standard of the Roman orators. And he had to be convinced that actually there were many subtle allegories in the Bible that revealed a hidden genius. So that is not an entirely academic comparison. There is some teeth to it. Now, comparing the authority of the church to the Davidic kings also does not work as a critique or not entirely. I agree with the concept of the church as, in one sense, a sort of revived Davidic kingship, but with key differences. We have the direct promise of Christ not to fail. When God removes authority from one king to bestow it on another, he always sends prophets to inform the people of what is happening. Samuel transferring the literal mandate of heaven from Saul to David, for example. And it is worth noting that Martin Luther never claimed, and does not claim, nor did Calvin, nor did Zwingli, nor did Henry VIII, that they were prophets. They are not prophets. They don't think that they're prophets. No Protestant would claim that they're prophets. Now, there is a man who does claim he is a prophet, and who does claim that the church went apostate, and who does claim that they are the revived church. That man is named Joseph Smith. And that church is the Mormon Church, which, frankly, I think is so historically illiterate, it is hard for me to take particularly seriously. Apologies to my Mormon friends. Now, similarly, comparing the church to a modern governmental authority does not work. Looking at, well, at what point does the modern government lose its authority? Because the Catholic would claim that, unlike modern governmental authorities, our authority comes from Christ directly. Another way to look at the matter is to put it into argument form. So, perhaps this, a syllogism, not a very exact one, I admit. I don't think it follows all of the rules of syllogisms, but something like this. Christ shepherds must teach correctly. The church is not teaching correctly, say on indulgences. Therefore, it is not Christ's church. It seems like a strong argument, but it can't really work because we know that individual teachers in the church can teach wrongly, so long as they are corrected after the church makes an authoritative pronouncement. And we have an example of this. St. Peter does exactly this after St. Paul calls him out at the Council of Jerusalem. Indeed, Paul accuses Peter of cowardice, of not going against the Jewish faction, even though he knew they were wrong, to keep the peace. But the church ruled, and Peter kept to the correct teaching after that. More than that, Peter writes 2 books that we hold to be inerrant in the Bible, 1 and 2 Peter. At least I think he probably wrote 1 Peter. I'm not 100% sure he wrote 2 Peter, but he probably did. Carl Philip Gabler says, yo, yo, yo. Hi. So, let's look at a different syllogism. The church hierarchy in a church founded by Christ must be morally upright. The Catholic Church hierarchy is incredibly corrupt at this point in time. Now, by the way, I would hesitate to say that the hierarchy overall is incredibly corrupt. I think that individual members of the hierarchy are corrupt. The Pope was sometimes corrupt and sometimes not. There were some good popes mixed in there as well. But anyway, let's pretend the church hierarchy is incredibly corrupt. Therefore, the Catholic Church is not founded by Christ. But that really can't be it either, because Judas was an apostle and 11 of the 12 abandoned Christ on the cross. So, how about this? The church's job is to shepherd souls to properly follow Jesus Christ. The Renaissance Catholic Church was not doing that. Again, this is a little bit overly broad to me, but let's accept it. Thus, they could not honestly be called Christ's Church, even if they at one time were. So, we're making a theory about apostolicism. This seems strong, but it fails if one believes that Christ established the sacraments, which is something that is key to the Catholic Church's claims. The Protestants don't have the sacraments, and the sacraments are the normative way that Christ distributes grace. By cutting Christians off from the sacraments, they utterly destroy the Christian's ability to follow Christ properly, and none can do it except in a stunted and more limited way. Point 2 is also unclear. It is certainly untrue, in fact, it is ludicrous, that no members of the church were good shepherds. Reform movements had been underway since the Western Schism, and if there was no value whatsoever, then the reform movements would have sprung from nowhere. But they didn't spring from nowhere. They sprang from good men who were trying to reform the church. Now, it is true that everything that I said does not disprove orthodoxy, but this is a discussion about the Protestant Reformation and not the Catholic Orthodox schisms. That's a whole separate topic. This is copy-pasted from a comment, by the way, that I made on John C. Wright's blog. If anybody follows him. My final commentary before we get to part 2. Swift Fox Mark II says it should be noted that Paul called out the followers of James for causing the early division with Peter. Yeah. Anyway, we'll discuss that later, though, probably. I would assume. So, my final comment before we get into part 2. Note that none of those are arguments for the Catholic faith. This stream and the following stream about the Reformation is explicitly not an argument in favor of the Catholic faith. That isn't the point. I am not making that argument. I am not arguing for the Catholic faith. It is about a Catholic understanding of the Reformation. I am saying, very specifically, that in order to dispute the Catholic faith, it is not enough on its own to point to the corruption of the Church. One would need to go further. One would need to dispute its interpretation of Scripture and Church history. To be fair to Luther, he attempts this, which we will discuss on a later stream. So I am not accusing Luther of doing this, but simply pointing out that there were orgies in the Vatican, which there were, or that the papacy was sold, which it was, or archbishops were siphoning off indulgence money, which they were, or certain preachers taught false doctrines, which is true. None of those disprove claims of the Catholic Church on their own. I say all of this because it is imperative to anyone listening for a Catholic perspective on the Reformation to understand how a Catholic can acknowledge hierarchical and papal corruption and not agree that the Reformation was justified as a result. Now, in terms of Martin Luther and whether Martin Luther did anything wrong and all of that, I am afraid I will have to leave that as a cliffhanger, though I do have my own thoughts on the subject. Now, I'm going to repeat again my sources before I hand it off to Ben. A Mighty Fortress by Steve Osmond. It's somewhat Protestant sympathetic, I would say, but it is a good read. Mostly he sees Luther as something like a harbinger of religious freedom. Professor Brandon Watson, and I think that's his last name, but I'm not 100% sure, has a history of the Renaissance popes posted on his blog, branemrys.blogspot.com, branemrys.blogspot.com. If you look at my link to the notes, that's at the bottom. It's a great and highly entertaining read, very much recommended. The book The Church and the Age of Reformations by Joseph and Barbara Stewart. It gives a Catholic perspective on the Reformation and its lead up. And I use the Catholic Encyclopedia for some fact checking and Googles and whatever popped up on Infogalactic for a few, noting on dates and general events that I did not think were going to be in much dispute. So those are my sources. I think 40-ish or so minutes is about enough for what I want to say for now. I think that to continue would kind of put the discussion out of whack. I will leave it off to Ben. And then at the end, we will take our questions. Ben,
Stand
it's all
by.
you, my friend.
I will be.
Oh no.
Hold on, I'm here. I will be with you guys in just a moment. I am just putting the finishing kibosh on something. I'm going to turn off the sound you hear in the background, which keeps me cool. For some reason, the St. Louis heat has really done a number on me. One moment.
So, while we wait, how great was I? No, I'm kidding. Ben's presentation, I have every expectation, will be well done and well researched. And again, this is not a debate. I am giving a perspective. In fact, I suspect that we are probably going to agree on many of the main points. Now, where we will disagree, well, I'll let Ben speak for that.
Well,
I'm just filling air.
Good, because my machine white noise was filling enough air for itself. So, I accept that you have given up your time, and will now go into my own sweet presentation. I'm going to pull up the
Ben made a PowerPoint of notes. I just wrote notes. Ben's PowerPoint means that he is just going to be probably a little more visually easy to follow.
Yeah, something like that. For some reason, window capture is not letting me capture it. Hold on a second.
It's God intervening so that I win the not
Oh,
debate.
there we go. Good job. All right.
No, I'm kidding. I'm actually curious. Like, I'm genuinely curious what you're going to say. Like, I actually want to see it.
There we go. Huh. So, to begin with, I'm going to mute you, Anthony, as I was muted during your presentation. Just letting you know. So, uh, so the Protestant case, pre-Reformation. This, like I said before, the Reformation is the most important sort of European event in history, probably in the world, outside of the death of Christ, which I never really take as a historical account as so much as a religious thing, and something outside time. I believe firmly, even though this is not applicable, that if a man was thrown into a time machine and then thrown into an Assyrian torture dungeon, his salvation would not be in any doubt. Uh, but there's a few things to go over. Namely, a lot of the problems that Protestants have with the church are a matter of history. Many Protestants have no problems with most of the church fathers, in so much as they are aware of them. That isn't to say that I agree with everything all the time. Many Protestants love and enjoy Augustine's work. Many of the scholars of biblical translation have a special place in their heart for Jerome, though they like Wycliffe more, and we'll get into him later. And there's a bunch of other stuff. There's much scholarship to it, but it's very academic. The average Protestant is not invested in the history of the Catholic Church in the same way that a scholar must or that a Catholic must. Many of the problems that come in that will be sort of the ultimate argument for Protestantism that I'll make through my statements is that the church became an idol for its followers. Uh, there's and I'll it's very difficult to go over this and just what it is, but I'm going to build it up when we get to the Council of Trent, which honestly is so important as to deserve at least a half episode to itself from the both of us. Um, it's like their Vatican II. Like we always talk about Vatican II. Well, they had the Council of Trent. You know, there's a whole bunch of things that come in here that are built in the build up to the Protestant Reformation. I have decided to focus on a few different things, namely just a few people here, councils, and the history of the Middle Ages going into it, because it is just that important. The Reformation is a matter of context, not of some dude randomly sticking his shitpost onto a church door. Which, pardon to contradict Anthony, which he did do, because that was like posting something for everyone to see. The king of the land would have seen it on his way into the thing. So would have all the archbishops and bishops and everyone else who was there. Like it was how they got information out to each other. It was tradition. Um, Hold on a second, guys.
Happy to be corrected because I certainly could have gotten it wrong. I'm just not sure what you mean.
So when he posted a 95 thesis on the church door, it was literal.
I've always heard it wasn't actually posted on the church, but I honestly that doesn't matter to me. The point is he got it out there.
Yes, but
Like
no, it
literally,
was
I don't care. Maybe it was literal. Either way,
it was a public declaration. Is my point. This wasn't hidden from
yeah.
anyone,
I'll
and
mute
it
again.
wasn't.
That's fine. Oh yeah, 100%. Totally agree with that. I will
Okay.
mute again.
But to go through the Reformation without the historical context of what the Catholic Church was doing to itself is entirely it's scholarly neglect. I'm not starting all the way back in Constantine, though I will mention the Council of Nicaea, the first one, which more or less all Christians agree on, and then it was modified in another council to be what the Catholics generally agree on. But the first one, everyone does. It's the Council of Chalcedon too. Funnily enough, even though that's basically, pardon the expression, the most perfectly logical way to define the Trinity and other things related to it to style on the monophysites. So moving forward, I am talking about the apostles. I lied. Uh, I want to make clear here when I talk about the church fathers and when I talk about the apostles, I am talking about different things. The until the victory of Constantine over his many rivals, the church was underground. Some, like Philip the Arab, who was emperor of Rome for some time, did not persecute Christians particularly. Some provinces just didn't do it at all, even when the emperor demanded it, even during Diocletian's great persecution. But it was underground. It was not a political power. Now, there were early church politics. I am of Paul, I am of Apollos, I am of Peter, so on and so forth. Anthony went over Peter being corrected. I'm not going to worry about that. We accept, and people have always accepted that the Pope is fallible, and the Pope can make poor decisions. That's never that's never been in doubt. But the kicker is that church division and church argument is a part and parcel of human sin nature. No Protestant believes that a church will be perfect until the Lord comes back. And when we say church, we do not mean the Catholic Church. We mean that final church that everyone who has died in Christ will become a part of. There's separations of language that have been codified into the Catholic Church that sort of force me to be very particular about my definitions. It's like this. If I'm arguing abortion, I do not let them say fetus. I say child, baby, boy, girl, whatever. The definition is not to be defined as something that benefits them. I would prefer neutral language at all times, but we're not so lucky. In fact, the letters of Paul and Peter and others are quite fiery in some ways. They have very strict language. They have very particular arguments. Even the order of the language is important when they're having their discussions. Moving to the church fathers, who many of them did have full copies of the Bible, or at least as much as they could get, certainly of the New Testament, they could only make decisions and letters and so on from what they had. There's a very specific sort of doctrine that isn't really doctrine, as in it's not like something God does talk about it, but he doesn't say it in the same way that I'm about to. But basically, no spiritual movement lasts 3 generations. Joshua's grandkids, even after he swore an oath that he and his family would be of the Lord forever, they didn't know what God had done for the Israelites. They were in the land. People were complaining 5 minutes after they crossed the Red Sea. Moses goes up into the mountain. They're making Aaron make a golden calf to be their God. Like the spiritual nature of the church, of the holy people at any given time, is that it changes, mostly for the worse. And I'm going to include Protestants in that. We're not special. And in fact, we're worse in some cases because at least there's usually an archbishop or something to whack people and get them into shape. But a church will just split if a heresy gets too bad or some boomers are boomers. However, to the benefit of the church, of the early church, of the apostles, there was one church. Peter was more or less the leader. James also is said to be the leader in some cases. That is the brother of Christ, I believe. I don't really know much about Apollos. I haven't studied him. He hasn't written any books of the Bible. Come back when you've written a book of the Bible. So what you have as the church fathers evolve is a question of heresy versus doctrine. I believe that within reason, the early church, the apostles that is, were uniform. And that even the argument of the Judaizers was more about a question of the Old Testament, which was the most important thing in their lives before Jesus came into it, is a reasonable argument to have. Sure, it's dumb from our perspective, but from their perspective, Peter had spent at least 30 years of his life believing that the Old Testament was gospel. Now he has a new gospel. But it's, how do I want to put it? Like, I don't worry about that. There are arguments to be had within the church. The problem is that things evolved. Scholarly men decided to make arguments about the nature of Christ, the nature of the Holy Spirit, the nature of salvation. And these issues had to be defined. The famous one being Arian being slapped around by Santa Claus, as the meme goes. But the thing is that it's not that simple. First off, he was doing a very bad thing that he could have been executed for, which is violence in front of the emperor. Because Constantine, or at least someone who was acting in Constantine's name as the authority of Constantine, was present. But also, it wasn't the purpose of it. When the vote came down, I believe only Arian and one or two other bishops voted for it. Voted for their doctrines against the right-believing church fathers. There's arguments, letters from Jerome and others and Augustine about this heresy or that heresy. There was the debate about the guys who bent and sacrificed to the emperor, sacrificed to Rome, while others were executed for not doing the same thing, and they wanted protections and what more. That doesn't mean that... it's not their salvation, as is understood, is generally not worried about. However, if they had decided to sacrifice to other gods, that was remembered and was a question of whether or not they should still have authority. You also have monophysitism, which is about the nature of Christ's godhood and humanhood, which I am just not going to get into. But they did cause so much trouble that it almost tipped the war in the Sassanid Empire's favor, the war against Heraclius and his predecessor. These things were so important, they almost defined world history against what we would consider the heroes of history, like the Byzantine Empire, like the Roman Empire, and more. Many of the German barbarians were Arians. This heresy didn't just become a thing that some academic scholar said and preached from his pulpit. Peoples, tribes were following this. You still had Jews running around. You still had all these other things. So the church, by necessity, had to define its terms. And that led to an ossification of the church and its doctrines. However, as we'll see with one example, and this is just an example I'm giving, that I'll give later, but there's others like the term Theotokos, which comes from the 700s, pardon me. There's a council that first used Theotokos. And it's not one of these. I'm just bringing up the church councils. I believe it was Nicaea too. Let's see here. This is iconography. You know what? It's not important. I'll bring it up later during the deeper Reformation conversation. But there were signs when language changed and became holy within the church. No one could argue against it for certain definitions. Transubstantiation is the big one that I looked up and did some research on, just because it's a bit important. Um, Moving on from the ossification of the church, you also had the ossification of Rome as the head of the church. That is to say, the Catholic Church and not any of the heretical churches. And this is before the Eastern Orthodox Church split apart. You had heresies spring up every year. It wasn't that crazy. You know, if it got big enough, they would have a council. They had a council about the Bishop of Miletus, for example. And they basically said, you know, all right, we're not going to excommunicate you, but you can't do anything outside your bishopric. That sort of thing. The Council of Ephesus was a council I'm pointing out as being one that sort of put down Antioch against Rome. Antioch was a big capital of thought and scholarship within the Byzantine and Roman empires. It was a big, wealthy city. Um, and it attempted to sort of subvert some of the authority of Rome for itself. And it was put down, and in general, people sort of allied against it. Alexandria, Jerusalem, and Byzantium, that is Constantinople, also had similar events happen, though from my reading and my studying, I could not find any particular councils putting them down like they did for Antioch. You know, there was an authority. There were struggles within the among the bishops. You know, you know, like Paul and Peter and stuff like that. Though I don't know what Paul's proper designation is in that sort of sense, but you know, it continued on. Letters were written, but in general, the rule was the Roman Empire was the Roman Empire for a reason. Therefore, the bishopric should be the top dog. Popes like Pope Leo, the one that worked with Attila, famously um, sort of kept a lot of authority over the church from it. And it kind of got him murdered when Ricimer moved against a Majorian. Um, I think it's Ricimer. Who knows with those German barbarians? Can't trust them. Moving forward, the next big change in church authority is Charlemagne and his Carolingian Renaissance. Anthony went over it. I'm not really going to um, go over it too much, but it was a big merging of secular and religious authority. The Pope had the authority to crown kings, but not just kings, emperors. It's like if the Pope crowned Constantine emperor. Same sort of deal. Even though Voltaire has his little quip about the empire neither being holy nor Roman nor an empire, no, it was holy. It was protected and given authority by the church in Rome. It was Roman, as in it was the descendant of Roman virtues and ideas, even though it was the German barbarians squatting on the ruins. And it was an empire. It ruled many separate peoples and many separate land areas. It wasn't a big empire, but it fit the definition of empire. The Carolingian Renaissance was the big sort of gathering of scholarship in the region. There were miniature universities here and there, especially in the east, Antioch, as I've mentioned before. But many of them were destroyed in the wars that happened, and there were a few events where basically the churches would get the local secular lords to fight each other, and then they would get wiped out or assimilated, depending on who won that. It happened in the Balkans. It's like, okay. Mostly the Aryans lost, though, and they were eventually exterminated. That's the important thing, though. This scholarship helped set up the humanism that defines the Roman Catholic uh, philosophies and theology and gives flavor to what they interpret from the Bible. Even though they would never say that mankind is perfectible, many of them had the idea that man's intellect could be perfectible, or some close enough definition. uh, or incorruptible. There were many different ways to say it, but essentially that mankind could understand the scripture with study and understand it perfectly. Not even Protestants say this. The closest thing we get to it is that one may read the Bible and then do what it says. But that is sort of a dumb way to do it. The Chad quoting Bible verses to the Virgin complex theology. Uh, this was led by Aquinas, who even I respect very deeply as a scholar, doctor of the church. He did define and codify many different ideas, but he did it from that humanistic basis. And I'll bring up humanism again during the proper Reformation one, because it is an extension of it. People blame the Protestant Reformation for the Enlightenment. This is false. The Roman Catholic Church's humanism is the biggest forerunner of the Enlightenment. Now, the Protestant Reformation helped, all right? The shattering of church power over scholarly authority did help. But the chief cause was the focus on humans and their relation to their own intellect and their relation to scholarship. So you have this culture of scholarship within the church that is constantly evolving and bickering with itself, and some things get codified and some things don't. And I will talk about the councils in their appropriate time. The Holy Roman Empire, especially with the investiture controversy, was entirely dependent on church authority. But that spread to other places as well, especially England. During the High Middle Ages, which is when all this really kicks off, and you have these problems and sort of the cracks begin to show. The Catholic Church must evolve, and it did. You have a whole bunch of events that set up worldly authority for the Roman Catholic Church. The Crusades being the biggest one, that's kind of the first one. And I'm saying that kind of not like definitively, because that's the one everyone knows. There were other smaller things here with the crowning of Charlemagne, which sort of started to set precedent, but with the peace of God and the peace of the king, which was, the same thing, just who was the highest authority at that time, you have the change from it. Now, you had some problems that came up that had been brewing for quite some time, namely the issues of doing worldly deeds for the remission of your sins. It's difficult to say how much is defined by the ideas that the remission of your sins may be given by by a religious authority in a non-direct way. Now, I know that somebody is going to say, sin no more. Many times Jesus talked about it. He has things he says to the disciples. I am not specifically talking about the direct go sin no more, my child. I am talking about blanket wide statements that as long as you go to the Holy Land and as long as you do this, that, and that, you will have the remission of your sins. There's no biblical scholarship on it, and this isn't the focus, but I'm saying that this is where you could see it, and it was given out to people in mass. In other words, the public was given it in an extreme way. And again, I'm pointing to the most well-known example, not the first example, or probably the most literary example. Partially because I am a plebeian, and I'm a man of the plebs, I'm a man of the people, even though I do carry on it like an elite. The people can only understand what they're given by their authorities. Part of the importance of the Reformation, as I will talk about with John Wycliffe and John Huss, is that one of the biggest things that you saw in these reformers was the putting of knowledge to the people, as in giving them access to Bibles and the Bible in their own language, more importantly. While people exaggerate how dumb Middle Ages peasants were, they were fervent desirers of God and Christ and the Holy Spirit. They wanted it. They went for it. The seeking was there. The problem is, if you go to a rally, to give alms, and they tell you that your sins are in remission, that you might even have the forgiveness of sins if it's a particularly corrupt priest, if you pay this much, or if you do these worldly events, that you will have this, that you will be in heaven sooner, or that you will be in heaven. Uh, this is dangerous to the salvation of that individual. If he goes in and says, "I will go into heaven," if he believes and says, "I will go into heaven if I go on crusade," that isn't salvation by Jesus Christ. That is salvation through worldly acts. Whether or not Peter has the throne of Peter has the authority to say that is not something I'm fighting over. I'm fighting over whether or not the average peasant understood where their salvation came from. And I would make an argument from these things, and if I were to actually make the argument, I would pull up the actual language used. Uh, but we don't have time for that, and that's not the focus of this thing. But that I would say that these peasants, even these knights, did not understand where their salvation came from. Moving forward, you have more worldly authority accepted as the matter of course, as the norm, not the exception, uh, continue on and spread throughout. And it wasn't just worldly, it was the religious sort of like domination of public life. And sure, there's a place for that. You need moral censors. You need people to say, hey, that's wrong. Don't have sex with prostitutes. So on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of things to it. But there's a difference between a moral censor and somebody who is upholding theology that is bad for the peasants' souls. Moving forward, these peasants who would have known about all these things going on, they would have known about the investiture controversy, they would have known about the Crusades, and so on and so forth. There's a saying during the Monophysite issues that you couldn't buy bread without the baker giving you his opinion on church matters. These people were consistently talking to themselves and each other about these issues. So it wasn't just some dude in a monastery making these decisions. People talked about them. You have the investiture, well, I called it the crisis, but the controversy, and the Concordat of Worms. Here, and I've mentioned this before, the Pope exerted secular authority through religious means. Now, the popes at these times were very corrupt, and it eventually led to the Avignon popes, which I mentioned lower down. But essentially, what good they were doing to try and take back the Holy Land and revive certain things and help the Empire of Byzantium, they were also sort of building authority within the world. They had the they had the example of crowning Charlemagne. They also had the Edict of Constantine, which supposedly gave the empire to the Bishop of Rome, which was a forgery. They had a whole bunch of things that they used, and essentially it brought a Holy Roman Empire emperor to when they were in power, specifically, to be barefoot in the snow at the door of the Pope's winter residence. Which isn't something that you can just sort of like brush off. This is a major power, a great power in the time of the world, which didn't have many powers at all, because the Middle Ages were bad for everybody. On his knees in front of the Pope. Now, don't get me wrong, I would be fine with that if he is praying to God, but he isn't. Sure, I absolutely believe that the appointment of bishops should be in church hands. I believe the pastor should, for Protestants, should be in church hands, not in the hands of the people. I have seen it fall apart. There are times when the people are stupid. But this set dangerous precedents that the church relied on later to cause trouble within the Holy Roman Empire and abroad. Part of that did spread to England with Thomas Becket, because the English king did want to curtail some of the powers and somehow the money transfers that were being done among the church at the time. Um, it's a very complicated issue and it's very boring, but it comes down to taxes. It comes down to money. It comes down to, it's less about the authority to appoint bishops, even though it was in there, but it comes down to this. And it was actually, from what I've read, a pretty decent piece of Reformation. But it ended with Thomas Becket being killed because he stood in the way of the reforms that the English king was able to convince the bishops of England to accept. It was, from what I can tell, somewhat accidental. And basically it's like, well, no one rid me of this guy. And then he was killed, and the King of England actually was very remorseful in a public way. And it's that's at least what I believe. Who can tell? It's 1,000 years ago. But it sort of created this sort of like tension between kings and Rome, especially in England, which was very separate from the rest of Europe and from Rome itself. And it spread around. Usually France was very pro-Catholic Church, especially with the namesake of my city, St. Louis, who, as far as I can tell, was a wonderful Christian. And anytime he could be the ideal Christian king, he took it. Was he a bit under his mother's thumb? Yes. Did he flagellate sometimes? Yes. But it's one of those things where, from what he said and what he did, he acted and promoted faith in Jesus Christ. And he was a proper son of the Roman Catholic Church. But not everyone was as excellent an example. Philip Augustus had his controversies with Rome, and at the end of all, you have the Avignon popes, which was more or less a power struggle between the French kings and Rome, as in Rome, the political power. And they were able to pull the Avignon popes to Avignon for quite some time. The primacy of the French king over the popes did not last, but it's just more examples of these. How do I want to put it? These secular powers and these religious powers being mixed and fighting with each other. Now, that is a normal thing for kingdoms to do. In fact, I promote a little bit of light warfare because it keeps cabals from forming that might create multinational empires. But you have the nations versus the Catholic Church. Now, whatever empire was going on, whatever the Muslims were doing, it's not as important. The important thing here is that the Catholic Church became a matter of worldly authority, not spiritual beneficence. The Roman Catholic Church was removed from its chief purpose, which is the salvation of souls. That is the only reason for any church to exist. Sure, there's teaching, there's, child services, there's elders and discipline and more. But the Great Commission doesn't get invalidated because the guy on the seat of St. Peter paid 100 guilders a cardinal for his seat. Now, I assume he paid more than that. Unless he got it on the cheap, 50% off the throne of St. Peter. You have these worldly authorities who promote their good over the good of Christ. Now, that doesn't mean that the Protestant reformers who came later always made great decisions and did what I said. No. Imperfect men will be imperfect men. I'll be sort of talking about Wycliffe and others, but there were heresies that flowed from Wycliffe and Huss and other things, even though they themselves were very rigorous with their doctrine, even if you may not agree with certain parts of it. They did not deny Christ, as far as I can tell. The but some of their followers might have. I know the Calvinists have on more than one occasion, though they didn't say it like that. So it's like I'm not expecting perfection, but what I am expecting, what I'm asking, is that the church be a church first and not a secular power. If the gospel is being perverted, if people look to the church and instead of seeing a place where they may receive knowledge for the salvation of souls, they see a place where if they show up and they are nice to the bishop, the archbishop, give a nice donation, their father, who has just died, will get out of purgatory or even hell sooner, depending on the deals at the time. Uh, but also, if they give that bribe, maybe they'll be fondly remembered the next time there's a burger meeting. Or they'll get a place of honor within the church or within the next church procession. The church was for sale. The throne of St. Peter was certainly for sale. And even though, I'll talk about this later, there were reformer popes, it did not solve the core of the issue, in that, like I said, the church was not acting like a church. The councils that are important to discuss are listed here. I thought I might have more time on them, but I think perhaps I made my point earlier. These are just sort of for your information. Lateran 1, they tried to separate the church from the matters of state, but I don't really think that went anywhere. They did reform the Nicene standards, and they said no married priests. Lateran 2 was just Lateran 1 again, more or less. Lateran 3 had the election of popes, no usury, and they tried to heal some of the schisms that had come up. The Lateran 4 put in transubstantiation as a term, which was first used by Lavardin in the 11th century. This is one of the things I was talking about earlier, where terms are created and then used, but they are not original to the church fathers or the apostles. Perhaps they had been used or had even been translated as such, but the term in scholarship was used by Lavardin in the 11th century first, and then it was quickly taken up by everyone because it's a good way to describe what happens at Mass. And it becomes a policy. Also during Lateran 4, papal primacy was codified. This happened in past the 11th century. It's, how do I want to put it? Like, it's not just something that came out of nowhere, but it's not as old as people say it is. Just like certain of the Marian doctrines. They're quite newer than you might think. Some of the Marian doctrines are not doctrines. They're not like, you must believe this to be a Catholic until the 18th century. They were there. There are some things I could say about Mary and what they did with Marian statues that would make you think, are they treating Mary like Mary or a pagan goddess? And these are things that they documented very carefully. But the idea of papal primacy doesn't exist until Lateran 4, where it is codified. It existed in the minds and they acted like it, but now it is law that Catholics must believe this. Confession is also set up in the way we would understand it in Lateran 4. Lateran 4 was, 900, 800,000 years ago. So it is these are very old terms. But the ossification of the church continues on apace. Even though these were viewed as reforms, they really did not heal the issues at the core. Constance the Council of Constance, that is, John Huss was a heretic, and it condemned Wycliffe as well, and ended the Western Schism. Or at least declared it over. I believe it was over for some years before that. Florence, papal primacy again, and they tried to reconcile with the Armenians, not Arians, Armenians, and the Orthodox Church. Lateran V, there wasn't really any reforms. Julius II tried to repair what he could, and bishops must approve new books before printing. In other words, there was a control over the information that would lead to some reformers getting killed just on the fact that they were spreading books around, like William Tyndale. You also had burnings of Bibles, of all things, on certain occasions. Like I said before, Nicaea and Chalcedon are mostly okay. Some of them, sometimes they use language that is very questionable, but quite frankly, it's fine. There are points in church history where the church fathers guaranteed 100% get it right, at least as far as our little human imperfect brains can tell. But that doesn't mean it spread, or kept up forever or over every single issue. There's at least one mosaic of a woman handing out the Mass, the Eucharist, in a catacomb in Rome. These sort of things, like there were weirdness. The Reformation isn't because of the weirdness. And it's good for standards to be codified. There is issues within Protestant churches over the Constitution and the need thereof. The problem is, of course, if you have a constitution for a church, people who desire power will use it for their own ends and become politicians. What the Catholic Church did was unfortunately natural to the sinful world we live in. The problem is that when it came time to reform, to refocus, things went awry. And they even punished some of the reformers who came to them during different time periods. Two of them have always been a favorite of mine. You have John Wycliffe and John Huss. And there were others. There were many Roman Catholic reformers. You could even make an argument that things like that Augustine, Jerome, and Aquinas did had a certain reforming je ne sais pas to them. But that's not the same as what was required at this late date. John Wycliffe, a man of England, was an authority of the church, a scholar. He wrote many books, but he was part of that humanistic tradition. He translated the Bible into English somewhat. I don't believe he completed it. His big issues was humbleness of the clergy. That is, they should be humble and they weren't, as well as money issues. Money. I have no desire to ever really talk about the complexities of tax law in the Middle Ages. I have done it before. It's not fun. Early sola scriptura, that is to say, he believed that you could basically pull first principles from the scripture without the need of church fathers or Aquinas or anything like that. And I'm just using Aquinas as an example. There were many others. His followers were called the Lollards. There was a synod called the Earthquake Synod that was set up to condemn him, basically. There was an earthquake, funnily enough, at the same time, and they were like, is God angry at us? And then the guy stands up and he goes, no, God is angry at John Wycliffe. And everyone's like, of course. That's exactly what this means. Notably, though, he was not a heretic, as in a great heretic, as you might think, until after his death. All right, that's very specific. While he was alive, he was allowed, if censured at certain points, and had to argue out his points, and was, had issues to do it. But he was not particularly a heretic until after his death. The Lollards were kind of minor Calvinists before Calvinism was a thing. They had issues. They were not as biblical as, say, I would want them to be, but they were very good. They preached Christ. As far as I can tell from their scriptures, whatever they thought of predestination and other issues, they did concern themselves with Jesus Christ and the salvation of souls. The most important thing John Wycliffe got up to is the translation of the Bible to English. Um, it was the basis of the King James Bible, which is so important as to be the linchpin of English writing along with Shakespeare's plays. He, how do I want to put it? Like, he followed the Vulgate, which has some issues to it if depending on your stance on the canon of the Bible, but he was as faithful as he could be. His Bibles were unfortunately burned. Um, I couldn't find any particular series of errors with them except for the usual copy errors, which pop up for everything. There's a reason why you can't just take the Vulgate and translate a Bible on it. There have been errors that have been passed down from copy to copy to copy. These books were thousands and thousands of pages long, uh, with, they didn't have as many words per page as we would. And each one would have to be looked over. And sure, they caught what they could, but there have been errors discovered throughout history, and even phrases added or taken away. Now, do these phrases often change the meaning? At least the ones I'm aware of have not been very changing to the meaning, though a few have more or less made a certain point here or there more specific. This is not an argument over, this is not a discussion of the canonicity of the Bible and the various books thereof, so I will not be discussing that. But his work was important. It was the start of a lot of biblical scholarship that focused away from what man could know through his own intellect and study into what the text says. It is not enough that we know the church fathers. The church fathers, I'll give them the benefit of the doubt, would one and all agree that you must start with Christ to be a Christian. We find Christ in the Bible, not in the, 11th century works of Aquinas or the Council of Trent or um, the Southern Baptist Convention at this point. Uh, this isn't to take away from Aquinas, but I'm saying that you can probably be saved by reading what he has to say about Jesus Christ, though your IQ must be at least 160. But it's not the easiest way to do it. He is talking about something as if you already know all these things. When I did my research on Mary, many of what he says is based on whether or not you're already a Christian and believe in the virgin birth. He affirms all these things. It's barely an argument for him. Yes, she was a virgin when she had Christ. And these verses say this verse says that, but the tradition says that James is the son is the brother of Christ. And blah blah blah. There's a rigorousness that requires somebody to already be familiar with these things, otherwise you're going to be confused. But a man can read the Bible as a story and be led to salvation through it as long as the Bible is in his own language or a language he can read. John Wycliffe, and by the way, the Bible was already translated into Latin. So it's not like there weren't biblical translations out there. There just weren't that the common people or the literate people could read. Going down to John Huss, I don't know why I put dates of his death. He was executed in 1411, I want to say. 1420. Wait. 1415. Basically, there was some Pope, anti-Pope stuff going on around the same time, so it was a absolute powder keg. He preached against indulgences and other things. But when he was called out, and there were some political shenanigans too, he appealed to Christ. And he said that the authority to judge him and the authority of his words came from Christ, not from the church. So the church could not judge him the same way that Christ could. He spread mostly to the university elites and the people, and and then to the people. He was burned at the stake after a heresy trial, and this led to wars. John Huss is the most important pre-Reformation reformer in Europe in general. Like John Wycliffe, very important man, set up the translation for the Bible to English and other things. Big reformer, but he doesn't have the same populist effect as John Huss. That I read some things that said that as much as 90% of Czechoslovakia, what we would call Czechoslovakia, was converted to what John Huss was preaching. Is it something that I would do? No, personally. I'm perfectly fine being an evangelical of some mysterious definition. But you can see that there was a hunger of the people for something other than the rules and the pay-to-win nature of the church. Whether or not all the issues of the Reformation were necessary, when it came out, the people either took to it or rejected it with violence. They ate it up. They argued over it. Now, humans love to argue. It's practically the human species sport. But there's something to it. Arians spread because there weren't any Christian missionaries to the Germans that the Germans were accepting in the same way. Arian was rejected, so the Germans said, come with me, we'll have some fun. You hate Rome too? Oh, and it spread around. The Monophysites spread from the same issues because there were many bishops who accepted it, and the heresy spread. However, it was a heresy that did die out eventually. There are some who say this, and there's some Nestorians and all that jazz, and you'll always find a heretical church somewhere in the desert. But in the sense of common populist power, it died away. There are still roots of John Huss's church in the Czech Republic, in Slovakia, and in other places. And the reason is because he preached the gospel and he was allowed to spread. There is a spiritual nature to these things. It is part of the spiritual war. And even though he was burned at the stake as a heretic, that does not mean that his words that his words should be ignored. Heresy does not mean that someone's correct. It does not mean that someone's wrong. All it means is that the powers that be stated that it was heretical. At certain points, the standards were higher than others. The Inquisition actually had very high standards. The certain heretical trials of the Catholic Church, like John Huss's and John Wycliffe's, did not. And I will give credit where credit's due. Various popes, bishops, archbishops, and so on did attempt to reform the church. However, they focused more on their own power, money handling, and heresies, not necessarily something that they considered well in hand. I'm saving things like indulgences, by the way, for its own little section. I'm saving Marian doctrine for a video that live stream that Anthony and I will eventually have to do, and I can bring up more things at other times. But this is the basis of what was going on from the Protestant perspective going into Martin Luther. Martin Luther would have known of John Wycliffe and John Huss. He would have read their books if they had them available for it as an examples of heresy. he would have been able to find uh, people and preachers of different times and different eras through their works, through the university system that he was a part of. A university system that had its roots in Charlemagne. Even though, there wasn't a direct one-to-one to one-to-one, it was part of the same sort of system that the Catholics took and spread everywhere. Many kings of Germany and other places had vast libraries, vast information that Martin Luther could rely on. The idea that the reformers were separate from John Wycliffe, John Huss, and others is absolutely nonsensical. Again, there were reformers within the Catholic Church, but the loss of focus on the most important issue corrupted what the church should always be focused on: the Great Commission. Salvation is the most important thing that a Christian is involved in. Not only his own salvation, not that I'm saying that works, bring salvation, but the spread of the gospel to others around him, so that not a single soul will go to hell. Life isn't always that perfect. We don't always, get what we want on that, but excuse me. But as the church grew, ossified, had its issues not being taken out, focused on political power, it lost sight of what the apostles considered the most important thing. Part of the I should do just a standalone video on this, because I think Anthony and I would be quite agreeable on it. But part of the most important thing that Paul and Peter argued about over the Judaizers was whether or not you had to be a Jew to be saved. I believe that Peter chose his decision. Hold on, Anthony. There we go. They can hear you now, just so you know. Was because it interfered and provided burdens on the salvation of the Gentiles they were reaching out to. Now, it deserves deeper study. I'm sure there's subtleties that I have missed. I did not study the Paul and Peter controversy because I figured that Anthony would get into it. But the focus as Christians, and part of what the Reformation sought, even though it got lost in the weeds and became political powers of their own and had their own issues, was that salvation of the people. That's my thing here. As you can see, it's kind of like a bit all over the place, but I needed to make sure that people understood that it didn't come from nowhere, that it wasn't just some random thing, and it wasn't just some guy doing it, that there were other reformers of power and intelligence and all that jazz, and that there was a history of the church choosing sort of like wrong beliefs, or beliefs that were unnecessary for the doctrine of believers, over sort of reforms that were needed. Again, I'll talk about indulgences later. The worldly power of the church is not something that should ever be ignored. I don't know why this didn't turn into bullet points. Anthony, how are you doing?
Woo-hoo. No, that was a good presentation. Made your points very clearly. So I'm going to mention John Hus briefly, since I actually did not bring him up. You are correct that Martin Luther knew about John Hus, and I know this because this comes up very prominently in the famous debate between Cardinal Eck, or was he a cardinal? I don't remember. Johann Eck, anyway, the theologian Johann Eck,
Yeah.
and Martin Luther, that led to Luther's excommunication, more or less. John Hus features prominently there. That's the reason, actually, I did not mention him today. In retrospect, I guess I wish that I did, since I had like 15 minutes to work with if I really wanted it. I could have ended it with a mention of Hus, since he predated Luther. But the reason that I didn't is because Hus is very prominent later on.
Yes.
So That's for the record. I did not forget about, and I do Hus, and I was intending to bring him up.
I
I was just bring him up later.
I brought up Hus because he is an important pre-reformer, and there was these
Yes.
are the two most famous ones. There was a third one I looked for that for some reason I could not find, but that's okay. Yeah,
Reformer.
yeah, I don't know why, but anyway, the ones that people remember are usually Wycliffe and Hus. Um,
So my thought on Hus. So I'll give like a very very brief general because I'm gonna talk about him more. Like he is actually important to the debates, like
yeah,
specifically. Uh, this is remember, Catholic versus the Protestant perspective. I think that they were correct to condemn him as a heretic, but there were promises made not to execute him that they broke.
mm,
This is
I forgot about
explicit
that.
and
Yep,
pretty clear. Yeah, and pretty clear at the time. Like they had made a promise not to execute him, and then he was like grabbed and executed anyway. And that I think because they had made that promise was wrong. Do I think they were correct to condemn him as a heretic? I actually do.
I have it.
Ooh.
Ooh,
Uh,
let's see here.
but he shouldn't have been executed. That was what I would call an own goal.
He said that when he died, this is his last words, so to say. Well, his second to last words. God is my witness that the things charged against me I never preached, in the same truth of the gospel which I have written, taught, and preached, drawing upon the sayings and positions of the holy doctors, I am ready to die today. Um, let's see here.
That's interesting.
So,
That's very interesting.
he supposedly his last words were "Sancta Simplicitas," holy simplicity, uh, because an old woman threw like his fire was too small, and basically a woman just threw a small amount of brushwood on it. It's like, what's wrong? And then it's as a comment on somebody's naivete. Yeah, no, it's not like I agree with everything host says. I just, he's important, um, and I don't
Yeah,
really have
no,
any
he
strong arguments
was,
against him.
to be honest, probably I should have mentioned him at the end of my thing, but it's not like I wasn't going to bring him up. The reason I didn't yet is because he's very prominent in the debates later.
Yep,
Like, he does not disappear.
yep.
You know, he is
There's
still a big deal.
in the how do I want to put it? In the like sort of arguments pro for against Protestantism, Catholicism, and so on, it's not like there aren't things that could be called on by church fathers or men like Hus, anyone who came before. Nothing was done in a vacuum.
I get you. Yeah, I get your point. So I think in terms of the approach that both of us took, I was trying to make a less raw, like, I was very specifically not making an apology for Catholicism, right? Like,
Right.
I was instead making a very specific claim in what
Yes.
I was doing. So it was a little bit more limited than I think what you were trying to do. Although maybe I'm being unfair. I don't know.
My central argument was that the Catholic Church changed over time, and trying to think of it, basically lost its purpose in a overall biblical standpoint. That it traded its spiritual authority for worldly power, which it undeniably had.
Yes, it did. So, in all fairness to Luther, Luther does make some of the arguments that I claim, and you, by the way, made for the record. So I'm going to throw
Woo!
that out there. You made some of the arguments that, not that I don't accept them, I would disagree, and if we had a debate on it, it would lead to a debate, but we're not doing that.
Nope.
So, anyway, you did make some of the arguments that I think are necessary to make, like to dispute with Rome. I was making my point is that I am a Catholic, so how can you be a Catholic and also say, yeah, I agree with a lot of there was a lot of corruption going around. That was my explanation to why, right? Like
Yep.
Because it's a fair, it's a legitimate question. I think it's a question that needs to be answered. Uh, in terms of the authority of the church, so the physical earthly authority. We'll discuss later what happens after the Reformation to the church, first in Germany, in Switzerland with Zwingli, and then later in England. And also, where was Calvin situated? Was it Sweden?
No, he was um,
What was that?
Zurich. Was it Zurich?
I'm blanking on Calvin for some reason.
I think it was Zurich.
No, Calvin.
No, you think?
Yeah, Switzerland.
Yeah. So weirdly,
Okay.
Sweden became Lutheran.
Those SW countries. Yeah, those SW countries
Geneva,
get confused
Geneva.
in my head. But
There we
which
go.
is yeah, okay.
Switzerland.
Got it. Got it. Schmidt says Luther did nothing wrong. You're kind of
King.
coming in at the end here, my friend. you're kind of yeah. But
Well,
on the other hand, Megabuster Shepherd went to mass for the first time in what's he say? I'm trying to find it.
2 years.
Mass after 2 years. So I claim victory over Megabuster Shepherd's soul.
Wow. This is the exact thing I'm talking about. See,
This is
we
what
see.
Luther fought again.
This is the corruption inherent of the system. Anyway, there's like an
The
archbishop
Pope
in a.
owns him now.
Right. So let's just go over the comments. What's up?
Yeah, just to finish my thought from earlier, since I got interrupted thinking about where Calvin was situated. So, in terms of like the authority of the church, that's something to look at next time. What happened to England? What happened in Calvin's hometown, Geneva, and what happened with Zwingli, and what happened in Germany after the Protestant Reformation. So, in turn, like I mentioned this in my notes, and I say it in passing, but I think that the Catholic Church's claims on authority, on one hand, exceeded the grasp that it should have had, but on the other hand, it's those claims on authority are what kept the Catholic Church from going the way of the Orthodox Church. For all of my criticisms of the Church today, it is actually growing in line with the population. It's not growing in Europe, it's not growing in America. It's growing in China, it's growing in Africa, it's growing in South America. In other words, anywhere there is suffering. Uh, which is historically what happens, right? So
I mean, yeah,
anywhere
like
that's
just so
it's
you.
not growing, and the reason for that is because, unlike the Orthodox churches, the Roman Church managed to maintain some form of political autonomy, but
Hmm.
that's not a defense of everything that the Church did. But I do think that there was a certain necessity in saying no, the Vatican is separate from the princes.
I would actually agree with that. There should be autonomy. I'm not a separation of church and state guy, but there is a very strong argument of something like it. The king should not approve pastors. Uh, if you get me. So it's like
The
there's.
investiture controversy was technically speaking centered around who could define bishops, but it needs to be understood with the political context that those bishops would become noblemen.
Yep. And they were
Like
treated
that,
and were noblemen.
yeah.
Like three
Both of those things
archbishops
were true.
elected the Holy Roman Emperor.
Right.
Like it was
Which,
important.
so I'm agreeing with you on that. Like, both of
Yeah.
those things were true. On one hand, they were taking the authority to appoint bishops, but that needs to be understood in the context of that was literally like how they got noblemen, was the appointment of bishops. So it was a power struggle. I like brush by it pretty like I don't go into the details of how it happened, but the short answer is that the church won the struggle at least at the time. Now you could argue it didn't really end in that in fact the Germans won the struggle cuz the Reformation happened. Which but they won in the immediate sense.
I don't
The
really.
church won I would say
I
like they came out of it with the ability to invest bishops.
Right. I personally don't think much of the investiture controversy. It is one of those things where it's like it's just politics. Like there had to be peasants who would basically come in, uh, hear a sermon about how the emperor cannot ever, have authority over the pews and the pulpit, and then they get the plague and die unsaved. Like I am absolutely convinced that must have happened. The but that's by the standards, I believe, as a Protestant, which we will discuss in a later episode. But it's like it's point. It was very pointed. It kept the Catholic Church from being under worldly authority, but it meant that the Catholic Church became its own worldly authority. That isn't to say that Protestants haven't had that time at in different times in different places, but I would prefer the sort of mass democracy of good Protestant churchmen over, a guy, an Italian who bought his way into, or a Spaniard. I forgot where the Borgias came from. Who paid the right amount of cost, and weirdly, he turned out to be a decent pope, which is the wild thing. Uh,
Which one are you referring to?
the Borgia one.
There
Not
were multiple.
oh
There were
yeah, that's right.
multiple boards.
The one who was during the Reformation but before Trent. Alexander VI,
Oh,
I think.
no, no, not. I
Uh
know who you mean though.
yeah.
You're right that I know who you're talking about. Not Leo, the one after Leo.
Yes.
So Leo the Tenth was the guy who Luther originally had disputes with, and after him, the guy who came in after him. You're right. I actually think did a pretty good job,
Yeah.
like as a pope, considering the fact that he had to deal with some tremendous, tremendous problems. Like all things considered,
Right.
to be that for that matter, we're gonna get into this next time. I actually, and I know you're. I don't know if you'll disagree or not. Actually, I'm not really sure because I don't know how much you look into it. I don't think Leo the Tenth was that bad. Like, I don't think he was as bad as his reputation
So
got. How about that?
so the problem with Leo the Tenth, from what I'm picking up on, isn't so much that he was a particularly bad pope in terms of choices. Much of what he did had been established in the Lateran consuls and other places, so it's not like it started with him. The problem is that he didn't dance with the music.
Yeah. So, what was going on with Luther was, in fact, historically unique, and Leo did not realize that. Now, you could say, well, it's not fair to blame him for that, and I would agree to an extent, but on the other hand, that's also why you just can't really say that he's a great pope. This was the thing he was dealing with,
Yep.
and he did not deal with it.
Yep.
Like, is it necessarily fair to say that? Yes and no. Like, no, I don't think you could really expect any, like, could you expect anyone to? But on the other hand, that is the issue that he had, and he factually did not make it better.
Yep.
Like, he threw fuel on the fire. His excommunication of Luther, and we'll discuss that. I'll stop now because
I'm
we'll
not
discuss that next information stream.
honestly, the excommunication of Luther is very unimportant to me. But yeah, we should save
I
it.
actually agree with you. I think it is not a very important point in history. Weirdly enough, like it was inevitable at the time it happened, and the events in Germany would have gone on the way that they did, more or less, whether or not an excommunication was read or not.
Yep. So, yeah. Like a lot of what I'm basing my arguments on, as you might have noticed, is not necessarily theology, but how the Catholic Church responded to the times. I think that's pretty important, to how things go and how the Reformation should be, called upon. And then when it's time to discuss the Reformation, since we already know when things happened, we can properly say why and for what reasons XYZ is wrong. Knowing that Mary was declared Theotokos in 732 or whatever it was, whatever council that was, I can't find it now, is not the same as ex cathedra. Some language that scholars use does not change the fact that people were acting in ways that I would say worship Mary and not just venerate her. I did a lot of research in college for a medievalist who was very interested in taxes, and basically had me scan books, which I read, as well as search books for little bits of information. Basically, one of the weirder stories, and this is actually pretty funny, is that there is more or less a 20, 30, 40 years, somewhere in there, stretch where every year they would have a big like town meeting in the church, and every year the priest would say, "Could I have more money for lunch when I go on the trip to the archbishopric, which was like 100 miles to the east or something?" And it's just a uniform no. here's here's like, basically they gave him $20 and told him to pay the rest himself. uh
That's pretty.
yeah, it was better. It was like, $100 for like 3 weeks or something stupid like that. It was pretty funny. uh but yeah, the questions of theology come up during the Reformation. Up until the Reformation, while you had detractors like Huss and Wycliffe over indulgences, the attacks on indulgences were not codified in the same way they were by Martin Luther. There's,
No, Luther writes them out in his theses. So
yep.
here's the. What
Well,
was I?
hold on. What we'll do is, in the lead up to the Reformation one, I will release a video uh, where I read out the 95 theses. Um,
You got to do it with good background music, though.
oh, we'll get Ken on that. We have our best man,
Well,
best man. Uh, but it's like that. Like, we could argue every point when it comes up. Like, we know where transubstantiation, as we use the term today, was started. But there was no one who argued with it because there was a certain amount of agreement, or an agreement not to fight over the issue of transubstantiation. Does that make sense? Like, I do not agree with transubstantiation.
no,
I do not fight over transubstantiation for any reason.
the thing about transubstantiation is that if you read the Canons of Trent on transubstantiation, uh, I'm about to say something that I bet you will surprise Catholics listening. This comes from Gospel Simplicity. He interviewed, I forget his name, and I wish I could find it. I had it in front of me. I wasn't planning on talking about this, though, so I didn't have it prepared. But he had it. He was interviewing a Catholic author who wrote a book on the Eucharist, transubstantiation, Protestant views on whether they and whether and how many of them could be synthesized with the Catholic viewpoint. His argument is that the way that that the canons on transubstantiation are worded at Trent, because that's when they're codified officially,
Well,
right?
they were
They
codified earlier, and let me pull it up. I clicked off of it.
they were stated as like they were like infallibly laid out in Trent. The way
Okay.
that it's worded, his argument, by the
Yeah,
way.
yeah, I got you. I knew what you meant.
So I haven't read his book, even though it's on my wish list. I want to get it, but I'll try and find it and link it to you later, and then make the other stream because you might like him, and also the interview with Gospel Simplicity, Austin, who's great. I really like him as well, but he's a Protestant. So anyway, he was interviewing this guy about it, and his argument was that the canons of Trent state that transubstantiation essentially is not allowed to be held as heretical. That you need to agree that it is a permissible understanding of the Eucharist. But technically, you do not need to hold it as your own understanding of the Eucharist, so long as your understanding of the Eucharist holds to the real presence of Christ in the Eucharist. He was actually making the argument on stream that John Calvin's understanding of the Eucharist as Christ is spiritually present in the Eucharist could potentially be harmonized with the understanding of the Eucharist. He makes a point, we believe God is spirit, and spirit is real. So to say that that is a denial of the real presence misses the point. Yeah, like, I don't think that that's he goes, I think Calvin is trying to solve the same problems that Aquinas was trying to solve when he laid out his theory of transubstantiation. But John Calvin is not the theologian that Aquinas was, and Aquinas was using extremely precise technical language. So it is a lot easier to misunderstand and misinterpret. And this happened both with the Protestants following Calvin, who have a much lower understanding of like the Eucharist than probably Calvin did, or the Catholics who were listening to Calvin. It was really interesting. I have never heard a Catholic make that argument before. And I put his book, after I listened to Austin's interview, I put his book on my wish list. Like I'm really interested in reading it now because I'm curious. I'm always okay. I am okay with stating no, the Protestants aren't necessarily wrong on this one, right? Like
Right. And
as a general rule, like
yeah, and like
Trent,
sorry.
like Trent's talk about sola fide and whatever. We'll discuss this later, and Trent is a great a really interesting topic for a council. Trent was a lot more patchwork than people realize. People think of it as like this is the council that got the church for the next few hundred years, and they're absolutely right. It was, but that it ended up that way was in a lot of ways almost a accident.
Mm-hmm. There's
Like
yeah.
it was a really desperate time for the church. And that was one of the good things that Pope did, by the way. The fact that he like fought for Trent to get said pretty much was impressive considering the issues that he had to deal with.
Yep. And the
I found it. I'll link it.
awesome. And the thing with just see here. Miguel Victor. Hello, sir. I hope you join us. Yeah, and watch our next videos on this. Also, check out Pinkerton's Ghosts. It is a very Christian radio show, and has some excellent horror. And one of our characters is even a Catholic. But it appeals to all.
We use a mere Christian. Yeah, we use a mere understanding for Pinkerton's Ghosts.
Yep.
Lewisian mere Christianity.
And yeah, but back to it. Like
I linked the book, by the way.
Where have you linked it to me?
In the stream, the StreamYard chat.
Thank you very much. So I will link it on your recommendation. So with the issue of transubstantiation, it is not a big enough issue to solo a stream, excuse me, by itself. Because simply put, my position is that when he says "do it in remembrance of me," it is symbolic, not literal. And they're very careful with the language. They do say "do it in remembrance of me," or it's more to quote unquote the ritual, even though I don't like that word, than it is to an actual transubstantiation or the spiritual presence of Christ within the wafer. And that isn't to say I consider that straight up Eucharist heresy. It's just that in the interpretation that I have chosen to accept, that it is a non-literal remembrance ceremony, not a literal you must do this for to be a good Catholic, to be a good Baptist. Baptists barely baptized properly. Let's be real with that. I think they'd mess it up. But the this sort of thing here, there are plenty of splits between Protestants and Catholics, but there's actually more that is together than you might understand. There were many missionaries who worked together. There were also many missionaries who acted in terrible rivalry to each other, mostly Catholic against Protestants, sadly. But there's a famous one where one of the first, I believe it was to India, one of the first Protestant missionaries to India, the Catholic priest, a Portuguese of the Portuguese descent, basically whipped up a mob and sent them after it and killed the man's wife, and other things like that, and had to drive him off. He came back and spread the gospel, but it's like one of those things where it's like, yeah, there were plenty of rivalries and horrible things that happened, but it's, not necessarily important to the stream, but it's like there are the things that happen here will echo out and affect Protestant and Catholic relations forever. That's the reason why church splits are so violent. In Protestant terms, it is more or less regulated to a single church, maybe a church and some smaller churches, and maybe at worst a denomination. Like there's a passive split off the Baptists that is going on right now. Basically, people are calling themselves evangelical or just not calling themselves anything at all. It's just the First Community Church of St. Louis, for example. Not that that's literally anything, but I'm saying that that's on the possibilities. The problem with the split of the Catholic Church away from the Orthodox, away from the Protestants, is that this was a sort of universal power, as much as it could be. The churches in Asia and in Africa were pretty split off, right, at that time. They didn't have.
Yeah, you get you get some weird theologies associated with them every now and then, but
Yeah.
sometimes you'll get like missionaries meeting up with them, and everybody will be shocked that they're actually like as similar as they are.
Yep.
So there's interesting stories, but
Oh yeah. But it's because it was one quote unquote church, the split was so violent and so messy, it caused sort of psychological splits forever. And it will cause splits for the rest of time. Um, and I will look at that, I guess. I will comment on comments in a moment, Mr. Victor. Uh,
so I linked to the Pope that we were referring to because I found the link. Remember, I mentioned that I was following the blog Brenemris, which is run
yes.
by a professor that I think is named Brandon Watson, though he actually doesn't mention it. Let me look. He has a complete profile.
Unfortunately,
It
I
doesn't even say his
study.
name. Amazing.
uh,
But anyway, it's just Brandon. It says Brandon even on View My Complete Profile with a link to the blog where he refers to himself as Brandon. I
Amazing.
think his name's Brandon Watson. He's a college professor. The Pope was called the third, was Paulus the third, or called the third.
Yeah. So, real quick, for just in general, I don't really follow bloggers about this stuff. I do follow certain people that I like. I do read Francis Schaeffer, but he's
Oh, I know
more,
Schaefer.
but he's more about art, at least in the things I care about. And he does have some wacky issues with the Holy Spirit, but he is very trustworthy when he talks about this modern era, at least up until his death. I don't think he
I've been
foresaw.
reading Bran Emrys. Yeah, I've been reading Bran Emrys for years, and he just decided one day he was going to do a series of posts on the Renaissance popes, and they were fascinating.
Oh
And
yeah,
they are. He's in the middle of them. Like he's not done with them yet. Paulus the Third is the most recent one that he did, which is the one that I just linked. So I recommend his blog generally, just because it's an interesting blog. Uh, but yeah, he talks about the Council of Trent a little bit in here, and he says, yeah, it's a very weird. Like the Council of Trent is actually a very weird council, and whether you mentioned that you think that you've mentioned to me before, you think it was meant to punish the reformers.
yeah,
I think what happened was that it started out with the intention of reconciling with the reformers, and then they realized very quickly that that was impossible. And then on every individual point, there were like these knockdown, drag out arguments, and they eventually kind of ended it with reaffirming what they already knew or was already like established teaching, but connecting it to some sort of discipline of the church, which is what made Trent unique. This is all stuff to discuss later, but it's
yes,
really interesting. Like Trent is super interesting, actually, like way more than people realize.
yep,
Because people think of it as a super organized, the Counter Reformation Council, and that is not what happened. Like
Right.
the fact that it ended up being what it was like a historical accident.
The the Council of Trent is fascinating. What's more, like it's not nothing's ever as simple as my rhetoric might say, but that's just because I'm very, very, like rhetorical on my arguments. I'm trying to be more dialectic here, not because of some sort of like, you know, desire to explain myself in the dialectic, but rather just to discuss things that are going on in a way that is more highbrow than the meme I put up, where it says, "What if you wanted to go to heaven, but the Pope said that'll be $5.99?"
That's kind of funny.
It is, but like I don't actually believe indulgences were specifically that. However, I do believe that people believed back then that it was like that.
Yeah, the Reformation starts off with the indulgence controversy, and the 95 Theses are like exclusively dedicated to indulgences. But there is, from the perspective of the Catholics at the time, I should say, nowadays, nothing you would blink at if you were a Protestant, but
Hmm.
from the perspective of the Catholics at the time, there is some weird wording in them where he seems to be questioning the authority of the Pope and councils. Isn't that odd? Like, huh?
Right.
Like if he had just stuck to legitimately, there were already major critics of indulgences at the time, which were seen as kind of like a mysterious practice. And if he had just stuck to that, probably he would have been fine. He might have been even remembered in history as like a reformer of the church instead of somebody who broke with of the Catholic Church, I should say specifically, instead of somebody who broke with the church.
Mm.
Johann Tetzel, for as much criticism as he deserves, and he deserves at least some, does deserve some credit for noting correctly that there are things implied in those 95 Theses that go a little bit further than indulgences. And Tetzel points this out, and Luther gets pissed. Now, Luther, to his credit, eventually, Tetzel dies a broken man, and Luther actually writes a letter to Tetzel apologizing to him, where he's just like, dude, it wasn't your fault. Like you were like the tip of an iceberg.
Right.
I didn't, it wasn't you who was responsible for everything. You just happened to be the public face. Like I didn't mean to drive you to your death. It's a little bit late now, but
Right.
uh, it's actually kind of funny. Like Luther actually writes him an apologetic letter, going "Look, man, I know it wasn't really you. You were just doing what you were told."
Right. And that's
Uh,
something with it. Like I do believe that there are plenty of Catholics that were good Christian men who did the best they could with what they had. Like St. Louis has some funky theology, but every time I go to study him, I just find a man who did his absolute damnedest to live out the Christian life, not for his salvation, but he lived it because he believed himself a Christian, and I believe also that he was a Christian. When he gets off his horse to bless a leper or a beggar or to give money or whatever, he's not doing this because he was the king. He could have ignored these people, and many kings just did, but he did it because he believed that it was his duty as a Christian. So at no point are we doubting the salvation of certain men here. Tetzel, sure, I dig it. He was a more complicated figure than, his poetry may give him credit to. But, what was going on at the time of the Reformation and the buildup is that problems piled on each other. And then Luther lit the kindling.
we better get to the comments because I am at. See, I'm locked in the walk-in closet so that I get good echo. And my computer, there is no outlet in here, and my computer is now down to 15%.
All right, I'll go over the
So
comments real quick.
yeah, maybe let's go over the comments.
All right. Philly, okay. Philly, okay. Carl Cabler, hey hey. Swift Foxmark, 2, hello hello. Should be noted that Paul called out the followers of James for causing early division with Peter. I don't know about that so much. I haven't really studied it like I should, probably. Carl Gabler calls for blood. Blood for the blood gods, calls for the skull throne, I'm sure. Uh, Carl Philip Gabler says, I always heard it was literally on the literal door. Yep, yep. And that was basically the bulletin board. Yeah, that's my point. Um, Anthony, you laugh at me for going back before Charlemagne. Megabuster
Yeah, I
Shep.
was like, is this too early? I'm starting all the way with Charlemagne. And then you're like, we must start with the apostles. And I'm like, never mind.
And I did,
I wasn't early enough.
and I even brought up the crossing of the Red Sea. Get on my level. Uh, in my next video, I will bring us back to Adam. Uh, so anyway, Megabuster Shepherd goes to mass, and Anthony crows in victory. And then fear grips his heart, and he asks whether it was Anglican, but Megabuster Shepherd says Spanish. He doesn't understand a word, but it counts. It does. I actually agree with that. As long as you understand you're here for Christ, a lot of things, kind of just get smoothed out. He's going to confession on Saturdays. Yeah, Seventh-day Adventists. Disgusting. Carl Gabler says, and there's, the one that accidentally was like, thou shalt commit adultery. Whoops.
I remember that, actually. The translation. That was like the Devil's Bible, wasn't it?
Maybe. I am not sure. There's some things I just ignore on purpose because it's like, I could memorize every atheist.
There's nothing to it. It's really funny. It's just a bad
funny.
translation. But
yeah. The Cathars took that literally, though, I guess. Megabuster Shepherd, to be fair, you have to have a very high IQ to understand the Southern Baptist Convention. Absolutely. And Megabuster Shepherd says that it's rather funny that the Reformation led to the creation of Prussia. Oof. Schmidt said Luther did nothing wrong. Megabuster Shepherd says Bavaria has the best Germans, especially their art students. Well then. Miguel Victor.
Luther would agree with you.
Yeah, he would. Miguel Victor says, well, I don't know why this video appeared to me, but I wish to share a channel of a Catholic priest that explains traditional Catholics a sad crisis what is going on now. The name is Reverend Anthony Cicada. Do you know anything about this man?
I haven't heard about it. I'm looking it up. He has a Wikipedia page. He was an American Sedevacantist priest and author. Was is interesting. Huh. Is he a is this Sedevacantism? This sounds like Sedevacantism. I'm not a Sedevacantist, my friend. I'm sorry.
I don't understand it. Don't get into it.
The
Don't get into it. No.
Would not care. So, I mean, technically, you're all Sedevacantists. Since you don't really believe in the authority of the Pope, so.
Is it a denomination of the Church, Anthony? Is this a denomination of the Roman Catholic Church? Anthony.
Do you actually want me to give you an explanation? Because
No.
you'll regret it if you do.
It's like somebody talking about the Holy Roman Empire. Fortunately, I have not had to explain it today, so I'm not going to. Miguel Victor continues. If I had to say one more thing to help you, I profoundly recommend everyone to study by some trust priest video etc. Discipline called Church's History, and read a book named Exposition de la Doctrine de la Église Catholique sur les matières de controverse. I think that's discussing the doctrines of the English Catholic Mother of Controversies? From the Mother of Controversies? I don't know. Sorry, dude.
I don't speak the French language. I was going to say something insulting, but I couldn't think of something on the spot.
Yep.
So, I don't speak French.
Made by Jacques Bousset, a Catholic bishop. He's Brazilian, so it's Portuguese. No wonder I probably mangled it. Have a good one. San Carlos Borromeo and San Francis of Assisi. Yes, sir. I do like St. Francis. He's a great guy. There's actually a statue of him hidden in the bowl of a tree in a park I go to, and I always nod to it when I pass it. Let's see here.
Ben worships statues.
No, I don't.
Confession.
I show respect. I show respect. It seems proper. You know what I mean?
I'm gonna send you a statue of Saint Francis in the
And I
mail.
would throw it in the trash because it's not the same sort of thing. Have a good night, sir. So let's see here. I guess you have to say it like 1195. Luther did nothing wrong. Yeah, sure. The 95 is the thesis, and the 11 is the 11 words. Here I stand. I cannot do otherwise. God help me. Amen. Oh yeah, that's the stuff. Gotta. I'm trying to think of another one. Acrostica. It's just 4 crosses end to end. Like it ends in the center. It's like get on our level, skinheads.
So, now that we're at the end of the comments, I just want to say that I had actually wanted to look up a quote from Martin Luther yelling at the Calvinists that we could post as and we could all agree on this. But I was disappointed to learn that Luther actually kind of was okay with Calvin. It was Zwingli he hated. he despised Zwingli.
Classic.
So a little bit disappointing.
The last thing I guess.
Opportunity for ecumenism.
It's true. You should look up humanism sometime and study its history. It's quite fascinating. So I guess what I'll say here for my final statement is that for yourself, a lot of these things are public knowledge and public domain issues. You may read what these men said and what they wrote in their journals. Wycliffe and Huss were preserved. Aquinas is, of course, preserved, and many of the doctors of the church. You can do a lot of research yourself to see what these men have said for themselves. And a lot of the issues of today, are repeated back then in their own way. And you can sort of look at it and say what issues are going on now that aren't necessarily the continuation of the same thing, but the same thing again, fresh. Even before Luther, you can find these things. You can read them for yourselves. The councils are available to read, and you can set them against the Bible and the biblical standards. I didn't bring up things like the fact that Titus and other verses of the Bible are very clear, all of Titus, about the standards for bishops. The fact is that if we took Titus literally, bishops being unable to marry, it goes against the explicit reading of the text, so on and so forth. You can take these things, and you can take a good translation of the Bible and don't bring up the message, and say, what do I have that they do not? What does this jive with biblical knowledge? If you're not able to go to the Bible, to salvation, to studying the Word, you will not understand the importance of the things we will say in our next episode. I want to thank you all for joining. You have been a wonderful audience, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. I believe
next week
is something.
Isn't it? Do we have an interview? I'm not going to say the name in case I'm wrong.
No, the guy has not gotten back to me on that.
I thought we had somebody. I thought we had another author coming in. I'll talk to you afterward, so I might be misremembering.
Yeah, no,
we're getting the date wrong.
There were a few people who I commented to, but nothing I can point to as a yes yet. But we'll talk later.
We'll have something good next week.
Yep, we will have something good next week. Have a good night, guys. All right.
So I thought next week we were interviewing Josh.